Okay, so we're continuing on Samach Dalid, Amud Aleph, um, and we're going to start a new thought. We completed the thought last week um, with regard to the question of, uh, in other words, how, it was an interesting question, is from Ravacha. He said, uh, how do we deal with someone who is gives someone else some extra money in some form, and do we treat it as ribis because we don't understand what the money is? Is it just a loan, or is it just a gift? So the Gemara went through some interesting permutations, and the last one was perhaps the most interesting. Is the Gemara wants to distinguish and say, yeah, you know what? It has nothing to do with that. He he actually stole from him in years past, and this was a way of paying back without having to, face the music. So he gave him a couple extra, dollars, whatever it was. So in other words, we hang our hat on the fact that we are avoiding ribbits at all costs. We're not saying it was a loan, it was this, was that. Either it was a gift, or it was a circumstance where he was paying back from an obligation. And the Gemara even goes too far as to say, not only if you stole, but if somebody else stole from him and you're repaying his debt, that's also okay. Again, what the Gemara is trying to do is trying to find ways to avoid ribbis. So when we say that when a person puts a few extra cents in someone's hand, that it's not going to be ribbis, and we're going to find every which way to avoid the ribbis question. That's how far we go. Okay, so now the Gemara will continue. Amar Rav Kana, I guess it's about maybe a third way down, roughly. Amar Rav Kana, have a Yosivna Beshila the Pirkei de Rav. So this is a very interesting Gemara. So Rav Kana was going to a shiur that Rav gave, and he came late to the shiur. And so he missed the first part of the shiur. All of a sudden he heard Rav saying, Vishamis de kari kari. So I heard Rav say, kari kari. I guess it's a vegetable uh, um, called, I mean, English it's called a gourd, but it's a vegetable that grows in the ground. And he heard Rav talking about it. He had no clue what the context was. So, V'lo yadana mai ka'amar, he didn't know what Rav was saying. Basa de kam Rav. So after the shiur, um, so he went. Rav Kana went. He went to one of the Talmidim. My kari de kam Rav. What was Rav talking about when he's referring to this vegetable? What was going on? I missed the first part. Amrli, so the Talmud said to him, Hochi kam Rav. This is what Rav said. It's amazing how detailed the Gemara wants to give us the story. It could have omitted this first part, just gone right to the heart of the Indian, which we're now going to talk about. But it went into every prat that Rav Kana came, he didn't hear, and then he asked, okay, Ozla Asara Kara B'nei Zarta. So this is the story. This is what Rav related. That a person went to a farmer or who had a field, and he had these the gourd. This vegetable was growing in his field, and he gave him money in anticipation of getting the vegetable later. Right? Perfect case of you're giving money and of course there's the problem of whether it'll be worth more than the money. I mean, this the typical case of ribbits we've been talking about. So he goes ahead and he gives him the money. Asara kari b'nei zarta. So at this point in time in the season, the vegetables were very small. They grow during the season, but at the beginning of the season, they're small and then they grow larger. So he gave him the money for a zuz. He gave him the money for these vegetables, for Amrele. Um, and so the farmer said to him, Yevna lo b'nei garmida. Uh, if you give me, in other words, pay me now. So that's the you pay me now, and later when these vegetables grow, he says they'll grow much larger. And for the zuz that you're giving me now, you're going to have a bargain. Because if you're giving me a zuz for these for small vegetables, and then they're going to grow much larger, and you've already given me payment, so I'm not going to ask for more money. So l'chayra, that looks like ribbis, right? He paid him a zuz, and he's getting back much more than the value of a zuz. So that was the circumstance that Rav was talking about, and he said. Uh, so Rav made the following distinction. He says if those vegetables are already grown to the point where they're larger, then shari.
Excuse
Why?
me,
Because
Rabbi.
because we know Yeshlo. Because Yeshlo, he has them in his possession, and let's say they're
Oops.
Rabbi froze.
they're an amma long.
Now you're good.
It's an amma. So then
Repeat the
fine.
last thing.
Say
We
again.
lost a little something there.
Okay, we good?
We're good now, but repeat the last minute or so.
Okay. So the Gemara. So in other words, he was paying him a zuz for what would be larger vegetables during the later part of the season, but right now they were still small. So, in other words, that's a classic case of ribbis. Here, I'm paying for something that I'm going to get much more than my money's worth. That looks like ribbis.
But they didn't exist in the world when he paid.
Oh no.
Don't we have that same problem that we've
Okay,
had before?
so now we're going to get into the details of different cases. So in this particular case, the vegetable was already in existence, but it was small. So the question is going to be whether if it's small, but it's already here, is that sufficient to say that we're going to avoid the case of ribbis because it's here, right? What's the Indian? It's Yeshlo. So he
Yeah.
has it. Okay, he has it smaller, but so what? So what happened is in the Shiur, Rav made the following chiluk. He said, "Shori, if the larger vegetable is already in place, meaning it's in the ground, and he gives them the money, shori. Less nahu, but if they're not in the final state, meaning they're smaller, osir, then it's osir. And again, classically, why is it osir? Because of ribbis. So that seems to be the case. And then the first kasha that everybody asks is pshita. What's Rav's chiddush? That's the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that if everything is in place and you're buying it and or you're transacting, you're fine. But if it's not in place and there's a chance that it's going to be worth more than what you're paying today, says the whole Indian, the whole discussion we've had in the Gemara about ribbis is I pay you today in order to get something later. Now we're going to see there's a lot of nuances to that point. But specifically in Rav's Shiur, he's elaborating what the Mishnah says. So what is Rav being mechadish? Here, Rav is giving a shiur and he wants to be mechadish that there is a difference between whether or not the vegetable is small or large, and that's exactly what the Mishnah says. So pshita. Uh, so if he doesn't have the larger vegetable, then clearly giving him the money for the smaller and getting the larger is going to look like ribbis. No question. So that was the kasha on that Rav Kana didn't understand because he gave over this whole shiur and he says, so what's Rav telling us? We know this already. This is a Mishnah.
But why? How can we be so sure that the buyer is waiting for the gourds to become much larger? Maybe he's buying small ones because that's what's in front of him. So how
But
can you, the observer watching this scene doesn't know unless
The observer doesn't know, but in reality, between the buyer and the seller, the farmer, is telling him, pay me now. I can't deliver yet, but pay me now.
so the seller knows, but it doesn't mean the
No, no, but look, in Ribis, we're not so much worried about Marisayan, what someone else is going to see, as to whether or not you have done something improper. Between you and I, if we've done something proper, the fact that Menashe or someone is going to see it, okay, fine, there might be Marisayan, there might not be. But you and I are the ones transacting, and between us, there could be a serious case of Ribis. Ribis doesn't really entail someone else being an
but
observer.
why would the farmer and the buyer they've agreed that you're paying me now for 10 gourds that will be larger later. There's no ribis speak. Why should there be a question of ribis?
Because he's getting a discount, Jay. The larger gourds would have cost him, let's say, two zuz at the time. He's saying, if you give me the money now, then I'll give you the product later. Now, is there 100% certainty that it'll grow? I don't know. I'm not a farmer. Maybe it's 98. Maybe it's 99. Maybe something will happen with the weather and it won't grow, whatever the case may be.
Why can't the seller give him a discount up front without calling it ribis?
But see, that's the problem. That's the problem. Al pi halacha, if you're not paying for what you're getting, you run into the potential problem of ribis. That's why we have these exceptions. We have several exceptions about whether it's the fixed price in the market. I mean, there's a
So
ways around it.
if
But
somebody goes to a store and you say this thing is on sale if you buy it now, that there's no ribis there because you don't know. I mean, the person knows what he costs him to make it, but sales are a marketing technique when you call it. It's not a discount necessarily.
right. So
How does that?
midorize, yeah, no, you're right. So midorize says there's no ribbis. In other words, plainly, there's no ribbis. This is a siyog. This was a sort of
Oh,
a protective way of the Rabbanan saying, don't get into these kinds of contracts or these kind of agreements. Again, midrabanan, they're saying you can't buy at a sale. I mean, at the time they didn't. We don't have what we have today, sophisticated, sales and all this other thing. But even in a sale, when you go into a store and buy, you're paying today and getting today, and you're getting a discount today. We're talking about future discounts. In other words, it's kind of like I didn't even know if it's a layaway, but you put down the money, and then there's going to be a future benefit for the fact that you put down the money today, and the Chazal say, that's not kosher. You shouldn't be practicing that. So they are the ones. That's not midaraisa. They are the ones who came up and said, that's ribis midrabanan. But we know as a point of fact that people were not as makbid. Okay, it's midrabanan, fine, but people did it. That's what people did, and we say that there is no repercussion. So midrabanan, the rabbanan say this is not a proper form of doing business. And okay, many people didn't, and some did, and there was no repercussion for doing it. The point being is that when a discount means that there will be a benefit to you for doing the transaction. Stop a minute and think. If I borrow money from you, I borrow money, and then when I have to return it, I have to return it, let's say, with a 10% increase. So what? So what? Okay, I had use of the money, it was valuable to me, and I'm paying you a schar for the use of the money. The Torah says that when people, and again, you have to have a different mindset when you think about the time of the Torah and what they're saying. That when a person borrows money, means he needs money, you shouldn't take advantage of him and say, when you pay me back, you'll pay me back something more than you borrowed. That was in order to sort of level the playing field, that if a person was struggling and he needed help, someone else shouldn't take advantage of him. In other words, this is bringing out the best nature in a person, And the Torah deals at that lofty status. You should not be a person who takes advantage of another person. So that's midaraisa. So midaraisa, it's clear cut that when someone borrows, it's because he has a need. Okay, buying and selling is different in reality,
Right,
but when
right.
someone borrows, then you shouldn't take advantage. The Chazal then came over and said, okay, I get it. But what happens in the normal course of commerce? Not a person in need. I mean, commerce means I buy from you. I need the vegetable and you have it. And I mean, right? So the whole system of commerce is based on a need that someone has. So, but it's not the same need of someone who borrows, who needs it, that could be for life support, as an example. I mean, there's a
Sure,
difference.
sure.
So the Chazal said, you know what? We're going to extend that ribis issue to just cases of commerce, and the expectation here is that the farmer would say to the buyer, you know what? I don't have these large, beautiful vegetables at this point, so pay me, pay
Uh,
me half for the small, and
but
when you have the larger, you'll pay me the other half.
in effect, he's borrowing money.
That's what the concern is. That's what the concern is, that it looks like he's
Buy,
borrowing,
the
and
seller's
therefore
borrowing money from the buyer.
for the buyer, and therefore would be ribis. That's the whole underpinning of why these are questionable acts. Now, again, today we don't think twice because we do it all the time. Everybody does it. I mean, that's business. But certainly in the time of the Torah, they recognize that, look, a buyer who doesn't have a farm is at the mercy of the farmer to get all of his food. I mean, he didn't have a farm. He didn't have growing, fruits, vegetables. So in a sense, that need was there because otherwise, how is he going to, he won't buy. He won't have anything. So Rav comes and says this chiddush. Frek the Gemara, what chiddush? The Mishnah stated specifically that yeshlo is a patur and einlo is not a patur. So how can you tell me, Rav, what are you being mechadish? Very interesting. So the Gemara says that no, there's a havamina. Ma detema. I might have thought in this particular case, what? Kiven de memela kor riboy, that these small vegetables are memela, in other words, they're going to grow no matter what. Okay, we're going to assume that they're going to grow. You don't do anything with it. In other words, it's not something that you've done to make them grow from small to large. It's the normal thing. So I would have thought, shopper dummy, that Ke'ilu, it's as if he was buying the large ones, because in point of fact, they're going to become large. And if they're going to become large, then you have a minute to say that when I give you the zuz, I'm paying the zuz for the large, not the small. In other words, what is Rav's chiddush? Rav has to have a chiddush over the Mishnah. So in this particular case, the chiddush, in other cases, we're talking about I pay you the money and you'll deliver goods to me later on. I mean, okay, goods are, let's call it a finished product, but I don't have the goods. Here, it's one step beyond that. It's not because I don't have the product. It's because the product still has to mature. So if the product has to mature, Rav is being mechadish and saying, you know what? When the product has to mature, but it's there in front of you, then even if it isn't full, there's no ribbis. That's the havamina. That's why when Rav gave the shiur, he's saying, I want to be mechadish something over the Mishnah by saying that if you purchase something that's in a different, smaller state, and you pay the money, and you're going to say, "Oh, I'm going to get a bargain later." No, that zuz goes to the larger vegetable, to the larger gourd. So it's as if you're buying the large gourd, and since it's already in the ground, yeshlo, so it meets the definition of being okay. Says the Gemara, Kamash Malon, therefore Rav's Chiddush is that this case is like every other case of ribis, just because he has the smaller one and it will grow into a larger one, does not allow him to take the money today for the larger one because the larger one, even though it's going to grow memela, isn't here. So that's the question. The question is, if something is going to be growing, do we say, okay, it, it hasn't grown fully, but it's here. The Metzias is here. So the question is Yeshlo enough when only partially it's here, not when it's fully here? So that would be the question here. How do we understand Yeshlo? Because if we're going to say it's Yeshlo, then the fact that it's small versus large shouldn't make a difference. So Rav is Mechadish. You know what? In this particular case, it's beyond what the Mishnah said. And in this case, also, it's not considered here. And therefore, he says, if you have it, fine. If you don't have it, not fine. So, in other words, we're expanding the whole discussion of ribbis into sort of a different realm. And we're saying, we know typically that when you discount something and you're going to get more benefit for it later, that's ribis. Is it also ribis if you have it here, as opposed to not having it? You have it here. It's just that it's going to be a bigger product, a better product, whatever it is. So that's the chiddush of Rav, that too is considered ribis. Without it, I might have said, you know what? Yeah, it's ribis if you don't have it. But once you have it, what difference is if it's small or large? You have it. It's here.
So
So
Rob,
the chiddush is that it is ribis.
it's still ribis because it's here, but it's not fully here.
That's right.
And
But you wouldn't necessarily think that on your own by saying, oh, the halacha of ribis is it's not here, but it is here. It's just not here in its full form, but it's here. So Rav's chiddush is that if it's not in its full form and you pay him the money, then you still can consider it ribis.
but
Now,
in effect, Rob is saying that the seller is borrowing money from the buyer
yes,
until it's ready.
exactly right.
And that's why he's calling it ribis.
That's right, because he's borrowing and he's going to give him back more than he got from him. Right. If you turn the sale into a loan, okay, lend me the money now, and I'll give you the product later. So by lending me the
See,
money now, it looks like later on he's going to get ribis.
but obviously, the seller, the farmer, is asking for the money. Otherwise, he would say, "Don't give it to me now.
No,
I'll
no,
give
for
it the
kid,
same price later."
yeah, he needs the money. He wants the money now to go into the market and do whatever he needs
So
to
it's a
do.
loan, converts to a loan right
Well,
away.
but that's how you see the intricacy. Again, in the world at large, these are not issues. But you see how Chazal are so exacting that between two people, there has to be a certain consideration, a certain fellowship, that if someone, even if, again, this is not a question of a poor person, right? He has some money, he just wants to buy something. That even in the course of Mekach and Memkar, of commerce, you have to be considerate. Now, of course, we've advanced over the generations so that today this doesn't become an issue because we have different ways of transacting. But at the time of the Chazal hadn't come up with this the Heterim yet. So it becomes a serious question.
So
Now,
how today would we make this a heter when it comes to the same story today?
well, again, with the Heter Iska, with the way commerce is done today, we 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 describe the deal differently than just I'm lending you and you're giving me. So if there's an established fee that is done for transacting the business, the fee is outside the deal. So the fee is not considered ribis because in the course of the commerce, I'm treating you the way you should be treated. But in order for me to be able to do that, how can I even do that if I don't have the wherewithal? So therefore, paying a fee, established fee for doing the business, that's why, for instance, even in think about brokerage for a minute. If you have a Jewish customer and a Jewish broker and he wants to buy stock, okay, back in the day, maybe it's different now, wanted to buy stock. And so to buy 100 shares, he had to give him the money and he had to pay a commission. So the chayra, that commission is ribis, right? Because he's taking money over and above what the value of the transaction is. It looks like ribis. But again, because today we're establishing in the marketplace that in order to entice people to do commerce, you have to give them something in order to, okay, it's nice to have be a kind person and a good person, no question about it. But Chazal understood that in Mekach and Memkar, there has to be incentives for people to want to do business. That's why they created this carve out by saying that if you're going to pay an established fee, it is not we're not going to put it in the deal. We'll put it outside the deal. And therefore, and again, that's with a lot of halachas that we do today in business and other things that we're simply not. I mean, if you looked at the Torah, you would say, well, we can't do this. This is not appropriate. So, and again, it's the language of the Heter Iska also that is written in that format. So that's part of the reason why many of the things that what one might look at and say it's ribis, where we're saying it's not because of these carve-outs and these exceptions. So now Rav was an Amora, and we talked about this in the past, is that when an Amora says something, I mean this is a very important concept. The question becomes, okay, where did he get it from? All right, because they're not Machadish Chedushin. I mean, with the end of the Tanaic period, then the creativity of halacha sort of terminated. And thereafter, it all became Pirish. In other words, the whether it's the Amoraim and later the Rishonim and Achronim, no one's being Mechadish here. Okay, the Chedushim already ended. So, Frek the Gemara, what's Rav's source? How does Rav come to make this claim to say that in such a circumstance it's still considered ribis, right? So the Gemara says, come on, who is he holding like? Who's Rav holding? And we get this all the time in the Gemara. So we have to find a machloike or tanoim who make that statement. So the Gemara says ki hai tanoi, hai tana, so that Rav is holding like the Tana, who says that the Tanoi can be learned in a brisa, haholech lachalov ezov. If a shepherd, a farmer, is going to milk his goats, or velizos es rechelov, or to shear his sheep, or lirdos as cavarto, or he was what's the term that they call someone who is he takes honey from bees. There's a name for him. He goes to a hornet to the nest, and he wears all this protective gear. And he takes out the honey from the hive, whatever. Okay, so in other words, this is his profession, and then he sells what he gets. V'amalo. So now he meets a buyer, someone he knows, and he says, "You know what? I'm going to make a deal with you. Masha Ozi cholvos machalecha. I'm going to milk my cow. I don't know whether I'm going to get a pint or a quart or a half a gallon. I don't know what this goat will give me today." So he's not giving him a specific amount,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
right? He's just saying, whatever my goat produces, I'll give to you for, let's say, a zuz, right? Here's the price. Or whatever I shear from my masha rechali gazras machalacha, whatever amount of wool I get from the sheep, I will give you. Okay, masha kavarti roda machalacha, and whatever amount of honey I extract from the beehive, I will give it to you. So we're talking about an open-ended purchase. You're going to pay me a zuz, but I don't know what you're getting yet. So in other words, you have to sort of work with me, and we'll anticipate. We don't know. Says the Gemara, mutter, that type of transaction does not give rise to ribis because you have not established a price. And this gives rise to a different halacha, which is mentioned elsewhere in the Gemara, and that is korov lehefsid is kamo l'sachar. The you're midway between a loss or a gain because if you sell it and you give him a gallon for what he's paying, you have a big loss because you're giving him much more than what the zuz is worth. And that's the problem with ribis because you're giving more than it's worth. But since you did not establish what you're giving him, how can you say it's ribis? Okay, what's the ribis? I'm buying a gallon. You didn't tell me that I'm buying a quart and you're giving me a gallon to look like ribis. So this pshat of korav lehefsid yatzaskara kamal l'sachar is what we say is the heter when you sell an open-ended product for a certain amount of money. No ribis.
But this could be if this turns out to be, let's say, those is normally the amount for a half a gallon. So if you sell a little bit, let's say it's a gallon. So if you sell a gallon and a pint or a gallon minus a pint, you're fine. If all of a sudden the goat produces 2 gallons today, wouldn't this be an ona issue? Because it's
No,
more
because
than a sixth.
more than a fifth. The
Yeah.
reason why it's not ono is because it's like buyer and seller beware. In other words, ono is when there may be some hidden fact that you didn't know or I didn't know, and
No, and
therefore
so since they're both going into this knowing
with
that
wide
it
open
could be
eyes.
wildly high or wildly low, you're at your own risk. Both
Yeah.
sides
And
at their
and
own
and
risk.
that's the shot in that of Karl Hefsid Kamal Sachar is that why did the Chazal establish such a principle? They established the principle because there will be times when people are willing to take risks, so you don't necessarily punish them because they've taken a risk. So in another circumstance, if I buy a half a gallon and then now you're giving me a gallon, that looks like ribis because I paid you for a half a gallon, you give me a gallon. But when there was an un there was an the amount was not clarified, then I'm taking a chance and fine, I'm taking a chance and I'll pay and I'll get more or I'll have to take less.
Why isn't this case Cheetah?
Say what?
Why isn't this case Cheetah?
Why? You might think, again, you might think that there is an imbalance, just like what Menashe said, is that so the Tana is saying that when the circumstances arise, and that's the Chiddush that he's saying. I mean, again, we're trying to understand how Rav comes to his conclusion, because the Tana said that if you buy something without defining what you're buying and you're paying an amount, you can't have ribis because it could have been more, it could have been less. Ribis means, by definition, I'm getting more than what I bargained for. What did I bargain for when I gave you the zuz? I
Fifty
didn't know
percent
what
of
I was, but
50% of the cases he's going to win or he's going to lose. So
right. So
why does
therefore,
Ribis only come in when you win? In that
no,
case,
right. But since he could have lost in ribis, when I give you the zuz, you're going to give me, let's say, the big gourd. I'm only going to win. I'm not going to lose. I'm not going to lose.
but in this case with the milk,
In this case, because he didn't define that he's selling him a certain measure, so by taking the money today, the buyer is saying, you know what? I don't know if I'm going to get more or less. And if I take less, I'll absorb it. If I get more, that's great for me. But there's no windfall in that I paid for less. In other words, saying there was less. So the chiddush here is that by not establishing what the terms of the deal are, you can't have ribbis. That's what this Tana is saying. That when you have a circumstance where it's a moving target, and
that
that's why the
makes a lot of sense.
yeah, that's why they came up with this Karv Lahefsid Chiddush is because when a person takes a chance, he takes a chance. So you can't always say that there's rivis. Yeah. Now, however, avolim omalo. Now, this is the second half of the brisa. If the if the the seller, in other words, the farmer, Masha Ozer cholvos b'chakach v'kach machala, I'm selling you. Typically, my goat may give me a gallon of milk. I'm selling you a half a gallon of milk, and I'm giving you this price, and it's a really good price because if you went into the marketplace after the milk was already produced, you'd pay more. So, in other words, this is typically the case of putting down money to get a product later, which is more expensive. Same thing with the sheep, right? I'm selling you, X amount of wool, and that is a bargain at today's price. The same with the bees, with the honey. So now we're skirting into a typical case of ribbis because I'm giving you a certain amount of money today, which later on would be a bargain for that product. So again, what the Tana is telling us is, and again, we know this, and that's the Mishnah. But the point is that we're making a distinction between a fixed product with fixed amount, which we know, which could give rise to ribbis, and something that is amorphous, it's not fixed. So how do you put your finger on and say, oh, it's ribbis, he got more than he bargained for? He didn't get more than he bargained for because he didn't bargain. He didn't say, I'm getting a half a gallon. He said, whatever it is. Maybe this goat is anemic and is only going to give him, a quart. So, and that's the halacha. The halacha is that when you don't define the deal in all of its precise terms, you can't have ribbis. You can't have ribbis when you don't lay out the facts of the deal, and that's an important halacha, because the Indian of ribbis is again, even today in ribbis, um, if some circumstance like this would occur, then you're, I guess in the what is it in the commodities market where you're bidding for futures of grain and other things. That's totally up in the air. There's no specifics. If you're lucky, then you get a windfall. If you're not lucky, you don't.
So why don't they use the market value? At the end, you have a discussion. Look, the market value was so and so. Now I'm giving you a lot more than the market value. The farmer says, I don't want to give you the full amount that the goat produced. The market value for the amount of money. In other words, why can't there be a discussion after the goat has finished, creating the amount of milk that they're going to have? At that point, the farmer can argue, look, yeah, the market price was $10, and here I'm giving you $15 worth of milk. That should be ribbis. You shouldn't take the extra $5 of milk from me. I mean, they had to have had an agreement that says no matter how much we get, less or more than the market value, you agree to pay the amount of money. And the farmer's gambling that he may get more than the market value. The seller is hoping that the production for this particular customer will be
And and
less
that
than
and
the
that the
market
halacha
value.
tells us, yeah, and that the halacha tells us is not ribbis. When you don't define, that's the missing ingredient in the conversation, is when you don't pinpoint at the outset of the conversation what you're buying, then it's a moving target. And once it's a moving target, you can't have ribbis. Oh, ribbis can only occur
But
when you have defined principles,
but at
buyer
the
seller.
center of the village, there is a market price for the actual amount that was created. I mean, there's a conflict here.
But
How can
but
they ignore the market price?
no, the market price will be what it'll be. I agree with you, Jay. But the chiddush here is you have to speak it out. In other words, you're right. Later on, the market will say, "Oh, for this gallon, it should be this," and he only paid that. Agreed.
But they have to agree ahead of time that the market value at the time that the goat
But see,
produces
they didn't do
milk
that.
is
No.
not part of this conversation. It's not part of the contract.
So you're right. If they set it out that way, then there is a chashash ribis. But
Yeah,
if he said, I need money now. Just give me a zuz, and I'm going to go and milk the goat, and this is a pretty good goat, usually gives, a lot of milk,
Right.
but I don't know if it will this time. From time to time, it gives less. So we're going to roll the dice. And the buyer says, you know what? I'm willing to roll the dice. Now they have agreed, have a contract agreed that whatever the amount will be, not a fixed amount, whatever the amount will be. Now, you could say, yes, but in the marketplace, this amount would be more, and therefore you paid less. But that's the chiddush, is that that only works when you and I have an understanding of what I'm buying.
So then
Then ribbis can
both
occur.
so
If we
both
don't
of
have an understanding and it's wide open, says the Tana, that's not ribbis.
but both of them are gambling,
Both of them are gambling.
and the
Well, both are
market
gambling. You can't have ribbis. That's the
maybe
underlying.
that's the kiddush when there's a gambler involved.
Yeah,
It can't be ribbis.
can't be ribbis. Exactly right.
It's a
But here's what's interesting.
different
So
kind of kiddush though, because that rule can apply to so many other things.
yeah, but to your point, I mean, how do we know that even in this gambling situation, what you pointed out before is later on we're going to see that he made a windfall and that should be ribbis. I mean, we don't know that. You made a good comment. You said, yeah, but later on, a price will be established. A gallon should be 2 zuz. He paid 1 zuz. Therefore, it should be
The
ribis.
other zoos.
Right. That would be the logical statement, but for the fact that the Gemara is telling us that that's not the case here, because the only way that can occur, which is correct, is if the buyer and seller came to terms on that point and said, I'm going to give you a zuz for this amount of milk. Now you're getting double the milk for the same zuz. Fine, that looks like ribbis.
I wish
But
Michael was here.
but when they don't agree under those terms, this is the chiddush of that Tana, and therefore he says it is. But the more important point is on the second part, what we just said. What did we just say? That if they spoke it out, im omalo, if he said to him um, that so much of the half a gallon of the goat's milk, I'm going to give you for this price, and that price for a half a gallon is below the market. In other words, it's not as if he's selling him a half a gallon for what the market is. He says, if you buy from me today, I'll give you a zuz for a half a gallon. And later on, that half a gallon is going to be worth 2 zuz. So that's the classic ribbis. So the Tana says that you can't do. You can't sell him the half a gallon of milk or wool or whatever it is, and take this lesser price because you know later on the price will double. And if the price doubles, then it looks like ribbis. And again, there's no, so you would think that there's no, what's the chiddush? I mean, but what are we talking about? We're talking about something that doesn't yet exist, right? The principle is, we agree. The principle is the principle of the Mishnah, no problem. But we're talking about something that doesn't exist. So the Gemara says, "Va'afal gav," even though the metila korabu, even though these products, the milk, the wool, the honey, you don't do anything. It's memela. In other words, you're going to go to the goat, you're going to milk it. You didn't do anything. You just took out the milk that was there, or the honey that was there, or the what. In other words, it's a dover that's there. You didn't do anything with it. So this isn't the classic case of I'm putting my money down, and later on you're going to give me something which maybe it's produced, maybe it's not produced. This is something that will happen by itself. Again, that's the nuance. Isn't that what Rav told us? Rav told us that if what? If you pay money today for a small gourd, and then later on you're going to get a large gourd, which you had nothing to do with because it happened by itself. Now, in theory, it maybe wouldn't have grown, but okay, if it grows, says Rav that that's ribbis. So therefore, Given the lesson who shata, therefore, since again, according to the second half of the brisa, since the wool and the honey and the milk are not here at this moment, it's not here. We don't have it. There's no yeshlo. Then says the Tana, that's why you can't do it. That's why it's also. So that's the Tana. And Rav holds like that Tana. Because we asked the question, what does Rav hold? Rav holds that if you pay money now and you get a lower price, it may not be lower for the small gourd, but it's definitely lower for the big gourd. When you get the big gourd, it'll be a windfall, right? Rav says it's osir because Itaka looks like ribis. With Rabbanon, it looks like ribis. Where does he get it from? So he gets it from the Seifa of this brisa, not the first side of the brisa that we've been talking about all this time about catch as catch can. Whatever it is, it is. That's fine. That's just has nothing to do with this. That's the first part of the brisa. The second part of the brisa says that when you establish a market, I'm selling you a half of the goat's milk, let's say a half a gallon, for such and such a price. Then when he and it's a low price, and later on when he gets the half a gallon, it should be two zuz, but he already paid one. That's ribbis. Wait a minute, why is it ribbis? Why is it ribbis? He had nothing to do with it. It was there. Okay, you could say that he bought it because he knew that he was buying something for that amount of money. What? Why is it ribbis? So the Gemara says it's ribbis because, and again, this isn't the classic case, because even though the milk and the others will come later, and again, we don't necessarily know the full extent of it, but later on, it'll turn out to be that he got a windfall because there was a measure. Remember, here we're talking about an agreed upon measure, not an open-ended sale. When it's agreed upon measure, says the Tana, it's Osir. And then Rav says, that's my case. That's the case of my gourd where I bought today for the small. Remember, the growth of the gourd is like the growth of the sheep of the wool or of the honey. We don't know what the flow is going to be, whatever it'll be. But since I made an agreement for a specific amount, which was far lower than what it should have been at the time I got it, therefore, this is the classic case of ribis because I am getting a windfall on something that, in other words,
I didn't pay for it.
yeah, he should have said, you know what? I'll put you first in the line, and later on, again, the price will be what it'll be. Presumably, it'll be more, and you'll pay me more, and I'll give you the milk. Okay, that's a straight case of there's no ribis there because he paid for the value of the milk. But if he pays today for the value of the milk, which later on is going to come out to be a lot more, even though he had nothing to do with it. In other words, that's the chiddush. The chiddush is that when you're talking about things that happen of their own accord, we have to be mechadish and say that's also usher, because you might have thought that in that circumstance it's not like every other case of ribis because you had no control over it. It happened by itself. So we say no. Even if it happens by itself, then in the case of the Tana, you have to pay for the. In other words, it's ribis when you get the windfall, and in Rav's case, it's also ribis when you get the larger gourd that you didn't pay for. So here we have a case where that's how he hangs his hat. And that's how we have to learn it is because Rav can say a Kiddush, it's a wonderful Kiddush, and Rav was the Gadol, but he still needs something to hang his hat on. And here we have the Tana who made this comment. So again, we see that the case of Ribis, how careful you have to be, and now we understand a distinction between establishing an agreed upon a term or an open-ended term. And by an open-ended term, the Gemara is telling us that karv lahefsid, that you're in between a hefsid or a loss or a gain. So therefore, there can't be ribbis when you've gambled that way to not know what it is that you're getting, right? All right. And now ikeda amre. there's an Ikeda Omre here, which happens to be Omar Rava, given the Metila Korabi Shapardami. So Rava is actually arguing on Rav, and he says, no, that I'm not agreeing to the principle that you're saying, because the chiddush of the fact that you have no control over the product, and you maybe at the end the gourd won't mature to the extent that it is. It's basically you're relying on nature, on the Rabbeinu Shalom giving the rain and everything else that will make this product grow. So Rava says that you can pay in advance and get the bigger product, and it's not ribbis. So we have a machlokes between Rav and Rava as to whether or not, in this particular case, there is ribbis when something of its own accord will grow, but you don't know at the end of the day. You do have an agreement that if the gourd grows larger, you will not have to pay more, but you don't know it. And because you don't know it, Rava says it's fair to say that there's no ribbis. In other words, in a sense, I guess, Rava is saying that this Yotza Hefsid, that this principle of Yotza Hefsid Kamala Sachar may apply even in a case where they agreed on a specific product. That philosophy of Yotze Sachar is when there is no agreement. Whatever it is, what it is. But according to Rava, who argues on Rav and on the Tana, and says that even in a case where I pay today and I get a bigger gourd later, since the gourd, I had no control over that gourd. So in that particular case, I can see the Havamina that since I don't have control over it, what I'm getting is what I paid for. I'm not getting a windfall on something that I didn't pay for because I paid and I took the risk. So this Yotze Sachar may be the underlying principle for Rava's position is that you have a specific agreement, but what happens if it falls short? So if that gourd grows only part way or not, is the deal avoided or not? What do you think? In other words, I'm paying a zuz for these gourds, and for these gourds, I'm paying face value. It's good. Their face value is a zuz. The face value of a large gourd is two zuz. But what happens if I pay the zuz and at the end of the harvest, the farmer says to me, this is all I got. This is the size of the gourd.
Didn't grow.
Farfallen, right? It's lost. So he's taking a chance. I mean, that's the point. He's taking a
Both
chance.
gambling. Like I said before, they're both gambling.
They're both gambling. But so when Rava, again, Rav's Chiddush, I understand. Rava comes and says, no, I don't agree with you that paying in advance is ribis. But when the underlying principle of paying in advance on something you have no control over, if I say I want to buy a bushel of wheat, you're going to give me a bushel of wheat because that's what will be transacted. But when I say I want to buy this gourd, that's still a nebulous term.
It
What
hasn't
is this
grown.
gourd? Is it a small gourd or large?
It's not fully grown product.
It's not a fully grown product. So I think that Rava's position is hanging his hat on what the first part of the brisa, which is when it's open ended, you can't have ribbis. It's open ended because it's going to get the gourd, but there's no certainty. So if the point is certainty, then Rava has a good taina. There's no certainty. I may get it, I may not get it. So anyway, it's something to think about because otherwise, I mean, Rava's arguing with the Tana. So what's Rava's chiddush, and why would he say that? That uh,
Did the Achronim or others later on in time?
so yeah, let's just go one step further. Frek the Gemara, Rava is coming and telling us this principle, but we just learned a brisa. Kach v'kach osir. If he says to him, I'll sell you a half a gallon of milk, of the goat's milk, right? And you're going to pay me a zuz. And when I deliver the milk, it'll be a windfall because by then it'll be worth two zuz. Says the Brisa, and to support Rav's position that that's usher. So the Gemara says simply, where's Rava coming from? Rav is going to argue on the Tana. That's exactly the point, Jay. Is the Tana made a pronouncement and said two circumstances. One where there was no agreement on product, and one where there was an agreement on product. When there's no agreement on product, you can't have ribbis. And when there's an agreement on products, you can have ribbis. And that's why Rav says what he says. Comes Rava and he says, I don't agree. But where's Rava coming to not agree to what the Tana says? So the Gemara says Rava's position, and the Gemara right away asks, where's he coming from? The Tana doesn't it makes the pronouncement. We have to go with what the Tana says. So now listen, here the Gemara is going to come to the conclusion. Hossam, in the case of the Brisa, where he was selling him the milk or the honey or the wool, lav mine koravi. Here's another chap. And this, so you see how thin you have to slice this. The milk and these other products didn't come about from what there was at the time of the transaction. Let's just say you have a sheep and the sheep has a pound of wool on it. Okay. By the time you shear it, it's 2 pounds. Did it have 2 pounds at the time we made a deal? No, only had a pound. So we want to distinguish now between the Brisa, which says, Lav Mine Koravi, that these products did not come from what was the product at the time of the agreement, because the time of the agreement was only a pound of wool, right? V'shaklalei lahai, and so you
Well,
could
Rabbi,
take,
it's easy to solve that problem. Just do it by the pound and not by the piece.
right, but
Because
if
if
we,
you do it by the pound, it doesn't matter if the gourd is small, large, if the wool is you know 2 bushels or however they measure the wool by, and you pay for what you're getting. Otherwise, you're playing the futures. Is really what you're doing.
right, okay, so listen to the nuance of what the Gemara is going to try to say as to why Rava is not wrong. That what we're trying to come about with a solution. Why Rava is not wrong because he's arguing with the Tana. The Tana says you can't do it, and Rava says you can do it. So now, as with everything else that we learn, we have to find some kind of distinction between the case of the Tana and Rava's case. Rava's case is the case of the gourds. Okay, that we know. The Tana's case is the case of the milk or the wool or the other things. So the Gemara says, you know what? There is a difference between the circumstance of the gourd and the circumstance of the brisa with the milk. What's the difference? So here's the point. The case of the milk or the other things, there is a finite amount of the product on the animal, let's just say. A pound of wool, half a gallon, whatever it is.
You can see it.
If you take that away, let's say you milk the cow or milk the goat or shear the animal, it'll regrow another pound of wool or milk or honey.
It's
So
different.
that says the brisa is you can't do. You can't do that because what you're now going to get in the future is something that you did not buy in the past. You have to understand the chilik. The case of the brisa, he's buying what exists today. The shakl lehu lahai, v'osa achwina beduchte. But once you milk the cow or the goat and take the wool, then something else will come to replace it. That's why, says the Tana, that's why says the Tana, because something will come in its place. Okay, now if he gets it, that's a windfall. That's a windfall, therefore that's osir. And that's what Rav holds. But Hocha, says Rava, Minei Koravu. There is no replacement. The gourd, which is small, will grow big. The choshok lelehai. Now, what happens if you harvest the small gourd? Are you going to get a bigger gourd later? No,
Mm.
because the circumstance of the growth of this vegetable is that you have to let it grow to maturity and then you harvest it. Says Rava that when you have a product that you're buying for which, okay, it's not a certainty, but the likelihood or the possibility is that it will grow large, then that's what you're buying. You're buying that product in its totality, and therefore it's permissible, says Rava. Unlike Rav, who holds like the Mishnah, like the Brisa, that when you're taking the milk or the honey and all these other things, you're actually not letting it grow to maturity and saying, "Oh, I'm going to wait until the goat produces more milk or the bees more honey. I'm going to harvest it now, and if I harvest it now, right, and then more grows, then what I'm giving you is a windfall." In other words, if he does it, the farmer's on his way to milk the goat. There is a finite amount of milk in the goat. We don't know how much it is. By the time he milks the goat, could be a day later, let's say, there's more milk. We know in reality that the goat keeps producing milk. So think about it. If when I made the deal with you, I made it for what the milk that was in the goat at the time we made the deal, but by the time I milked it, it was more. So that really doesn't that really look like ribbis? I'm giving you more than what we agreed on because we agreed on the milk of the goat when we made the deal on Tuesday. And on Wednesday, when I milked the goat, there was twice as much milk that the goat was producing. And now I give it to you. That's ribbis. But
Everybody
Rabbi,
Rava
everybody
says
knew the next
that's
day would
what's
be
that?
more. Everybody knew ahead of time the next day would be more.
but that's not necessarily true because the next day it might not be more.
It might
Because
not
if
be
you're
more.
milking, right, because if you're milking a goat, let's say, or a sheep or whatever, if the consistency of the cream that it has, or if it's not drinking or if it's not feeding off the ground, the grass, the grazing, you're going to get a weaker quality of the milk or
But
talking with a vegetable or something.
the wool keeps growing, though. You know that.
Right, right. But the Gemara wants to make a subtle chiluk to support Rava's position that what? That there is no ribis for the large gourd. And the Gemara said, how can you say that? The Brisa says that the exact opposite. So the teretz is that the Brisa's circumstance is not Rava's circumstance. Rava's circumstance is you have one gourd and you're buying that product and now it's small and then it's going to grow large, but that's the product I'm buying. In the case of the brisa, the circumstances are different, says the Gemara. It's not an even understanding because in the case of the brisa, what you're buying, you make a deal, and it's a deal that it has moving parts to it, just like the gourd. But the gourd is not replaceable, these are replaceable. So that's the chiddush that the Bryce is telling us is that when the product is replaceable, because the milk will get more, and the honey will get more, and the sheep will give more wool, when those things happen, then you have a ribis problem. But in Rava's case, where that's not the case. Again, we're trying to make distinctions between a brisa, which is pronouncing a halacha, and Rava, who says the opposite. Says the Gemara, no, he's not saying the opposite. He can agree with the brisa, but his circumstance isn't the brisa's circumstance because harvesting gourds, which when you harvest them, there is no secondary growth, is not the same as taking milk or honey or wool where it'll regenerate. So, in other words, sometimes we need to find some distinction that gives us permission to say they're not alike. And here it became clear that Rav was holding like this Tana. But Rava came along and said, no, how could he say that? The reason why Rava says it is because the situation of the gourd, which Rav was talking about in the Shiur, is not the same as the Brisa. The Brisa is talking about one set of circumstance, and Rav in the Shiur, when he was talking about the gourds, is another sense. Again, what is the Gemara showing us? That there's hairline distinctions, okay, where it's a fine line that we're drawing to make a distinction between the gourd situation and the brisa situation, because the mitzias of the brisa, the examples of the brisa are different than the example of the gourd. That's what we need to understand. And even if it's a subtle difference, Jay, there is a difference, and therefore Rava can support the position that there is no ribis because he says, I don't have to hold like the brisa.
Because the
I
gourd,
honor the brisa, but the brisa is not my case.
so there's an assumption that the gourd, once it's harvested, it doesn't grow a new gourd.
That's the assumption. Correct. That's the assumption.
Otherwise, for
Another, it's a
anything to
seasonal
regenerate,
item. It's a
anything
seasonal
that,
item, Jay. It grows from the beginning of the season to the end of the season. When the season's over, it doesn't grow.
so they have to plant new seeds to
But
get
then you're talking about a whole new product.
a whole
And we're
new
talking
cycle.
about, right. Milking a goat goes year round.
It's,
And,
the same with the wool.
right. But when you talk about a product that in and of itself becomes finite, now you have to start from scratch to a
And
brand new.
replant. You have to replant, and that's a big
You have to replay. And there Rava says, because you have a whole new circumstance, it makes the gourd, it makes it permissible to pay the money for the large gourd because you know at the end of the day that's what you're buying.
So
It
the
is,
same thing with flowers that regenerate every year.
right.
It would be the same thing as the milk or as the wool. I mean,
Uh,
people grow flowers.
but they have
Flowers,
annuals and they have right.
right,
So
right,
right. So if you have to replant the flower every spring, it's a
that-
new flower.
right.
It's like the
It's like
gourd,
the gourd. It's like
like the
the
gourd. But if they can regrow of their own, then in a sense it's like the goat's milk and the others. Because so again, it's fascinating how finely we can distinguish between two items, and therefore Rava can have a heter to sell the gourd and to sell it for the lower price because he knows it's not a windfall. He knows he's paying for that product. That's what he's paying for. And if he's paying for that product, then the seller is not going to give him ribis by giving him more than what he bargained for, because that's what he bargained for. He bargained for the large gourd, even though today it was a small gourd. But in the case of the milk and honey, it's not. Again, sometimes the Gemara is fascinating in how it makes distinctions that. So Rav holds like the Brisa, and Rava says the Brisa is not me. My case is different than the Brisa. And Rav says no, that the gourds are the same. He holds that the case of the gourd is the same as the case of the milk of the honey, and therefore he holds that it would be ribis, and you're not allowed to do it. Again, it's fascinating in many ways how the Gemara sort of interprets this. So, all right, it's Hashem. So, um, all right, so we'll stop here.